Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. I'm JJ Kimchi. As many will know, the text of the Babylonian Talmud contains a wide array of topics, addressing just about everything that the rabbis deem to be important or worthy of notice. In recent years, scholars have become increasingly aware that select passages of the Talmud are in fact interacting with a rival religious community that was taking shape precisely during the centuries in which the Talmud was being written, namely Christianity. Some of these Talmudic interactions with Christianity are direct, some are subtle, and some require a great deal of scholarly excavation. Understanding the backdrop of Christianity can, according to some scholars, shed a great deal of light on some of the important stories and ideas within the Talmud. One such scholar who has written extensively on the subject is Dr. Michal Bar-Asher Siegal, who is a professor at the Goldstein-Goren Department of Jewish Thought at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, where she also serves as the Vice President for Global Engagement. Professor Bar-Asher Siegal was an elected member of the Israel Young Academy of Sciences and, aside from a position at BGU, has served as visiting professor at both Harvard and Yale. Her latest book, Jewish-Christian Dialogues on Scripture in Late Antiquity, was published by Cambridge in 2019 and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award that same year. It is a pleasure welcoming her to the podcast of Jewish Ideas today. Professor Bar-Asher Siegal, welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I look forward to it.
Excellent. So we're going to dive into the questions, and we're going to actually begin with a large and quite contentious topic, which scholars have been debating now for decades, which underlies much of what we're talking about, which is the topic of the divergence of Christianity from Judaism in the early centuries of the Common Era, what is sometimes called the parting of the ways. So right at the beginning, of course, Christianity was a Jewish sect. The followers, the initial disciples of Jesus were all Jewish, and they considered themselves part of the great umbrella of Jewishness in general. But over the centuries after the first century, they eventually became their own entity, became their own religious group. And so my question to you is, well, how did that happen? And what was the process by which Christians split off from the rest of the Jewish community? And roughly when can we say that Christianity was in itself its own religion?
You started off with the toughest questions, I think, of all for the topic of religious studies as a whole and comparative religion and Jewish studies and, rabbinics and ancient Christianity. It's a tough one because not only does it have a great significance for the study of all those categories of study that I've just mentioned, but also because it depends on how you want to examine that question. So would you want to check if Christianity is different from Judaism by its praxis, by its beliefs, by its self-determination, right? How do you call yourself? So let's start with this last one. So let's assume that a group becomes a group once it has its own name. Once I no longer call myself Jewish, but I call myself something else, that means that there is something else, right? So scholars have looked for the first time where the word Christianity appears, right, in Greek, or Christian, and said, okay, so that's the cutting point. And we actually find probably Ignatius was the first one in the early 2nd century. He talks about the first time we have the term Christianity. And he's very upset. And he says, I see around people who think that they can be both Jewish and Christian, but it's a monstrosity to think that you can be Christian and Jewish at the same time. And you can hear him talk. And in the beginning of the 2nd century, he's very clear about the fact that there has to be a separation. And he uses the term Christianity for the first time. So a lot of scholars, and it works with a lot of other parameters too, a lot of characteristics of a separate group. You could say around the Bar Kokhba revolt, 135, and that works with other stuff as well. So people tended to look at the separation at the beginning of the 2nd century. Some people used to think that the separation between Jews and Christians started with Jesus himself. Jesus came and preached himself. He called himself a Christ, preached for something else completely. So maybe it happened, in the time of Jesus. So we're talking about the first 30 years of, Common Era. Or maybe it's not Jesus at all. Jesus was Jewish and operated within a Jewish setting, but his disciples, and especially, someone who saw himself as a disciple, Paul, he's the one that invented Christianity in the 50s. So maybe then. So if we're looking at theology, that might be a different answer. But if we're looking at praxis, what do people do? Then it gets much more complicated. So you can see we have evidence in writings Chrysostomus in the 4th century yells at his audience in Antioch and said to them, "Why are you fasting with the Jews on Yom Kippur? Why are you going to their synagogues on the festivals of the trumpets? We have laws from Spain and Vyra and Turkey and other places in the 4th century, laws that prohibit eating from the matzahs of the Jews or not keeping Shabbat. Or we have evidence in the 6th century in the Persian Empire Christian that they circumcised, and we have evidence in historic writing from all kinds of areas that suggests some kind of kashrut laws that some Christian kept. So wait, what does that mean? So we can have lists from the early 2nd century listing all the stuff that Jews do and Christian don't, and all the stuff I just mentioned. Shabbat, fasting, lunar calendar, circumcision and stuff. This is what Jews do and we Christian don't. But then if you go and check the records from each place specifically, you might find in praxis that they do it. So wait, are they Christians? Are they Jews? They're listening to this, this guy yelling at them, don't do it, while, they have a membership card of a Christian church. So are they Christians? Or are they not? If they fast on Yom Kippur? So all this kind of stuff leads to a different question. So what does it mean to part ways if you call yourself a Christian, but you practice not to mention, and here I add another possibility to answer your question, who are we reading? Are we reading the guy yelling at them, Chrysostomus or whatever, Augustine, or I don't know, all those Christian church fathers who expressed the need and desire to separate from the Jews or whatever, or the people they're referring to? I'm writing a book at the moment. It's about to come out with Cambridge University Press. I want to call it It's Complicated. I outline a rule that's called the bus sticker rule. In Israel, you have in the buses in the front, you have those like two seats that sits one in front of the other, right? And there's always a sticker that says, don't put your feet on the seat in front of you. You can learn two things from this sticker. By the way, I've noticed that the US doesn't have those stickers. I checked this personally, but Israelis do. And you learn two things. First, you learn that the bus authorities do not want you to put your feet on there because it's going to dirty the seat or something. The second thing you learn is if there's a sticker, it's because you need it, meaning people are putting your legs. Same thing with laws about don't take matzah from the Jews on Pesach, or don't ask the Jews to come and bless your crops. Is you need those laws because you have people who don't want it done. So they are the ones asking for the separation or the parting of the groups very specifically. But also you have the laws because people on the ground are doing it. We learn what people are actually doing. So who do we listen to when we look at the separation? We're looking at the speaker, or we're looking at the people he's addressing. And how do you determine history? I don't know if you got from this long speech that I just gave how complicated it is to answer your question about the parting of the ways. What's fun is that we've learned that it's complicated, and we learn not to give simple answers. And we learn to say, and this is exactly what my book is about. My book is going to be semi-popular, and it's going to survey the literature for the first 600 years and say, listen, we have to look at all kinds of angles. And we have to look at it specifically for a specific location, a specific time, place, and specific genre of literature. Would a sermon in a church be different from a law? Would it be different from historiography? Would it be different from, we haven't even begun to talk about biblical interpretation and a joint text that they have, blah, blah, blah. All of this makes it such a rich picture of the past that makes answering your question complicated. And it depends. It depends what you're reading and what you're asking.
I suppose it is an unfair question the way you pointed it out, especially is because asking when Christianity diverges from Judaism requires a fixed understanding of what Christianity is and a fixed understanding of what Judaism is, even to ask the question. And if you can't arrive at those, then you can't really answer that question. Okay, fair enough. You've convinced me that that question is almost impossible to answer. But as you say, it's fun asking it and exploring the...
I don't think it's impossible to answer. I just think there's many answers. I don't think it's impossible. I think it is possible to answer. When did they define themselves as a separate name? Where did they stop doing that? We can answer a specific question within that question once we define what we're looking for.
Okay, so going sort of zooming in on our topic for today, let's go to specifically the era of writing or of the rabbis of the Talmud, and both in the land of Israel, but more specifically in Babylon where they were. And I just want to ask a sort of a quite technical question, which is, what was the Christian presence there? geographically and just in terms of where they're located and what they were doing? Were the rabbis of the Talmud surrounded by Christians? Were they Christians in close proximity? Would they have met them on the streets? Would they have been able to read their text? And what kind of proximity and interaction possibility are we talking about just from a plain on the ground level?
So the question that you're asking in itself is new. And the reason for that is that for many historical reasons that had to do with the people who studied the Talmud before, I would say in the 19th century, when the critical study of religious texts began, both on the Christian side and the Jewish side and others, it was very comfortable for the people studying the Talmud to say, so first of all, there wasn't connection between Jews and Christian. It was easy for those scholars who used to be Orthodox Jews, who looked at the text as, committing religiously. They were very comfortable with saying, well, there was no connection between Jews and Christian at all. If there was, it was very polemical, and we would find it in the corpora of texts that were composed in the land of Israel. Why is that? Because there were two major empire. You can't see me because I'm guessing you're only hearing me talk about this with my gesturing with my hands. But there were two ancient empire in the ancient world, two major ones. There was one, the Roman Empire, who becomes Christians in the 4th century. And the land of Israel is its most eastern province, right? So everything that was written there, starting from the 4th century, was very much connected to Christianity. So if it had anything to do with Christianity, it would be there. But the Babylonian Talmud was redacted in a different geographical area, in modern-day Iran and Iraq, which was under the Persian Empire, which was Zoroastrian all the way to the Islamic conquest in the 7th century. And Christianity and Judaism were both minorities, religious minority in that empire at the time that the Babylonian Talmud is composed. So you can find scholars, esteemed scholars, such as Urbach, for example, in the 50s, writing, there were no Christians in the area of the Talmud, so we don't have to even consider them for the Babylonian Talmud. That works very well with the bottom line that the Talmud is the text we are, as Jews, committed to it, halachically, in the way we practice Jewish law today, and it has nothing to do with Christianity. It worked very well also because on the Christian side, Christian studies tended to ignore everything that was produced in the eastern province, in the Persian Empire and the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, that was written in Syriac, in the dialect of Aramaic of Christianity. I can tell you, I was at Harvard, and there's manuscript there that are still lying around waiting to be published. And you can find in every Ivy League university a classics department that teaches in Greek and Latin, but Syriac, you can count on one hand where you can learn it. And that's not a coincidence. The study of ancient Christianity focused on Western Christianity and not Eastern, which made it much harder for scholars to check the possibility of connection between them. That all changed, I would say, with Sebastian Brock, who was a very famous professor in the 70s and later on led to a revolution, an actual revolution in the study of this Eastern Christianity, and also changed the way with the change of scholars of ancient Christianity and the expansion of the scholars who study, such as myself, women, non-Jews, and people who look at this text more historically, were willing to look at the Babylonian Talmud from a historical point of view and say, wait, were there really no Christians in this area? And guess what? There were a lot in this area. And not only were there a lot, they were speaking in a dialect. The Syriac dialect is extremely close to the dialect of Aramaic in which the Babylonian Talmud is written in or composed in. So they had a mutual language. They were in close proximity geographically. If I could, again, I'm gesturing with my hands, you could see that some of the sites are very close by, and they were living side by side, and Christianity was a major force in that area at that time. Having said all that, what does it mean for our outlook at the Talmud? Does our default assumption, should it change? Did the rabbis of the Talmud know anything about Christianity while these texts were composed in the 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century, 6th century? Did they know anything about Christianity of the same time? Because if they did, that would be a very interesting source, first of all, for the knowledge of Christianity and the connection between Jews and Christians, but also for the creation of those two religions in the most important centuries of their creation. These are the centuries that you asked me about. The parting of the ways, the creation of rabbinic Judaism, the creation of ancient Christianity in the East and the West. And this is why my field of study is so exciting. We're now learning to look at the Talmud anew and ask, wait, having said all that and having all this historical background, what can the Talmud tell us about Jews and Christians at those early centuries? And I can tell you, it can tell us a lot, and it's a lot of fun. First of all, there's a reason where the Talmud was neglected in the study, because not only were scholars not interested, the Talmud also does it in an interesting way. A lot of the time, besides the explicit passages about Jesus in the Talmud, we have very few references, direct references to Christianity in name. But that doesn't mean the Talmud doesn't know Christianity, doesn't refer to it. There's a lot of other ways to refer to Christianity: hidden, satirical, polemical, acceptance, in dialogue, but you have to know how to look for it. And this is where the new area of study, which I'm fortunate enough to belong to, really looks anew at the Talmud. And we've just begun. The next time you interview me in I don't know, in a few years, I'm sure I'll be able to tell you much more, because we've just begun to explore this in a very interesting way. But the results and the findings are very exciting, because we find out that the Talmud and ancient Christianity were in contact, were in dialogue. They knew about each other. They were creating and reacting to each other. And that's a lot of fun to find out.
I look forward to that, and I look forward to the publication of your next book, which will no doubt win a Pulitzer and a Nobel Prize and all these sorts of things. But until then, we can still talk about some elements of this field. So you mentioned a little bit about the character of Jesus, who does come up in the Talmud a couple times. So let's address that a little bit, because that in itself does reflect some of the attitudes of the rabbis at the time towards that man who became known in later rabbinic literature as Oto Ha'ish, right? The man, that individual. So let's ask about that. How is Jesus represented in the Talmud? What are the names that are given to him? What are the stories told about him? And can we deduce from that something of the rabbinic attitudes towards him and his followers, I suppose, at the time?
So, first of all, the stories of Jesus in the Talmud were always at the center of attention. And that has actually to do with scholars of ancient Christianity. Again, in the 19th century, with ancient studies of ancient Christianity in a subfield called historical Jesus, we're looking for information about Jesus. We have very little information about Jesus. The Gospels about his life were written very late, in the 70s, in the 80s of the first century. He was crucified in the year 30, right? So we have a gap there. We have letters from Paul in the 50s who mentions Jesus a little bit, but they're missing information about Jesus. And guess what? The Talmud has a few stories about Jesus. So these stories were known to scholars, and they dealt with them and they looked at them. The problem is that the Talmud was redacted much, much, much later, right? The Talmud is redacted in the 6th or 7th century CE. So using this as historical evidence about Jesus' life is problematic, which, we now know and we now understand. I think it's kind of a consensus. Not that using the Gospels is not problematic, but that's not my fight to fight. And not only is it late, it also has its own agenda. The rabbis were not trying to keep historical evidence about Jesus, though you might be able to extract some historical information. We can talk about that if you want to, but they had their own agenda when they were talking about Jesus. And what is this agenda? So first of all, there are not a lot of stories. There are a few, and some of them are not very nice. And we paid a dear price for them not being nice. Some of these stories were actually the cause for persecution of the Jews. In famous trials of the Talmud, Jews were accused for blaspheming Jesus, for condemning him, and they were right to do so. So there are all kinds of apologetic ways to say, no, that's not Jesus, that's his cousin, it's someone else, it's not that. When the Talmud was redacted when it went into print, some of these passages were erased or censored to avoid conflict because some of them sound not nice. So we have passages talking about Jesus's afterlife where he's sitting in boiling poop. We have stories about him being punished for, rightly so, for, mocking the sages or being sexually promiscuous, all kinds of stuff like that the Talmud preserved. All true. But there are some passages where you can sense at the same time where they're doing that to Jesus and presenting him at that, they're also preserving some kind of mixed emotion about Jesus. First of all, he's presented as being one of us once, as a sage, and one of the sages of the rabbis. He's also mentioned as someone who knows his Bible, knows that he's a Talmid Chacham. He's preaching. He talks about it. This actually appears also in the Gospels. But that Also, there's a very famous story where he is portrayed as the point where he leaves is presented as somewhat his master's fault and something that could have been avoided. And some of the story is a misunderstanding. It shouldn't have happened, which I think is extremely interesting because, again, assuming that the story is written as late as the 6th century, or at least redacted at this point, everyone knows that Christianity is a huge force. By the 4th century, it's the winner of world religion. And still the Talmud preserved the sense that it could have been avoided. We could have kept him in. We could have avoided this other religion that we know existed, which I think is extremely interesting. That's number one. Number two, some of those stories also present knowledge of whoever wrote those tradition of New Testament, of early interpretation of the New Testament. And that's, for me as a historian, is really interesting. If a story that mocks Jesus, talks about, I don't know, him looking at, in that story about the woman's eye, someone there knew that Matthew talks about Jesus saying, do not look, take up your eyes if you're looking at another woman. Someone knows that and mocks it. So while the story is not nice to Jesus, it's also preserved knowledge of ancient Christianity. So for me, the author knew enough about Christianity to mock Jesus. So while it's mocking, it also presents some kind of kingship or closeness between the author and ancient Christian literature. Wow, that's interesting. That's complex, right? So you're mocking Jesus, but also, so all of this is, even the Jesus story is the most harsh one. They still present knowledge of ancient Christianity. So what does that tell us? So all of this is extremely complicated. But again, bearing in mind that these stories has a history of their own, because they actually led to bloodshed against Jews. So this is something that we have to always keep in mind. I remember that's the one thing that always my Christian scholars are surprised when I tell them the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin takes full responsibility for the killing of Jesus. The rabbis say that they executed Jesus, and all the professors are shocked because we know. The one thing we know is that the Jews did not kill Jesus, right? They didn't have that
A long history of the accusation of deicides we want to avoid.
And we know, every modern professor knows that this is an accusation, that it's wrong. And historically, the Jews had no power to kill anyone and never killed anyone. But the Talmud takes full responsibility. They think the Sanhedrin killed Jesus, and they go through the process of it. And they brought, witnesses. And why was he prosecuted according to Jewish law in Sanhedrin? That's extremely interesting, right? So what does that do to the complex history of Jews, that not only at the time of the Talmud, but later on in medieval time and all the way to modern time, and blood libels, etc. So very, very interesting. I have to say, and I'll stop here for a second, that when I teach this to audiences, it really matters if I teach it to Jewish audiences or I teach it to Christian audiences or non-Jewish audiences. I have to, I say, look, they're mocking. But what does that mocking say, and what's the other side of it? And it's always very interesting to present this size of things.
It's interesting, and I suppose what has arisen from what you were saying, the various stories, is that on the one hand, there are parts of the Gemara which seem to try and push Jesus away, but other elements that seem to claim him as coming from the rabbinic tradition, as being a student within the rabbinic academies and being eventually subject to its laws, and the sort of dynamic of keeping and pushing away. That's fascinating stuff.
And again, all the way to the 6th century, it's kept in a text that was redacted as late as that. They already know that Christianity is the big winner, and they're still preserving that notion, which I found extremely, extremely fascinating.
That's fascinating. I want to move on to some of the other passages in the Talmud which you have pointed out, or you and others have pointed out, the Christian background. But two of the famous ones that you've highlighted are the ones about the story of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai in the cave, and the other about Elazar ben Dordaya, who sinned and then sought to do tshuva, sought to return. As you've written, that both of these interact with or show signs of engagement with Christian texts, Christian ideas. Could you clarify what exactly is the nature of this interaction? What Christian backdrop can we see when reading famous Talmudic passages like that?
So the two examples you mentioned are taken from my first work on based on my dissertation topic, where I actually try to show this. It's actually an interesting background. I came to Yale I did my BA and MA.
Was the first mistake. Yes.
Yeah. I went to, I was just telling JJ that I skipped Harvard for Yale, and I don't think he's forgiving me for that. But in any case, I'm a Yaley through and through. But I want to say that I came to Yale after I did my BA and MA at Hebrew U in the Talmud department. And I, was studying Christianity at Yale. I felt I needed this. General courses that had nothing to do with Judaism. And I'm reading this stuff. And I took a class first semester at Yale, and I took a class in monastic literature, the literature of the monks. And I'm reading this, and I'm like, some of this stuff is super familiar. And I know this, and I know this, and I know this. And I'm like, this is not possible. I was taught there's no connection to Christianity. If it were, I should find it in the Yerushalmi or Midrash Agadah, but not in the Babylonian Talmud. How is that possible? And slowly that developed into a book where I try to say, well, monastic literature, the literature of the monks, of the Christian monks, was extremely popular. These were the rocks of the holy men going into caves of the monks everywhere, becoming people who can talk to animals and can bring rain when there's drought, and they can do miracles, and they can sustain themselves with no water and no drinks and they live in caves. And all of this, these were people who lived in the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th century, a very, very, what we know today of the monasteries. This is where it began. This was an extremely popular movement, translated to all the languages. How in supermarkets you have those like magazines with the celebrity on them. This is the holy man of the ancient world. Everyone wanted to know who they were. They came to visit them and see them, paparazzi of them, saying all kinds of stuff and looking at the monks. They were super popular. And I started saying, well, could the rabbis have known this literature and used it in the Babylonian Talmud? And surprisingly, I found a few examples showing this. Yes, they did. They knew this literature and they used it. But what's interesting about it, no one has said this before, and this was like a new discovery, that because the Talmud doesn't explicitly mocks Christianity. There's no mention of heresy or minut. There's no mention of Jesus or the word Christianity, nothing. You have a story about a sage hiding in a cave from the Romans, but he's hiding in a cave, and he can do miracles when he comes out of it because he suffered. He talks to Elijah of all people. He lives off a tree and a fountain of water. Now, this story is very weird in rabbinic literature because we don't have stories about sages living in caves, almost no stories. Also, the fact that the story assigned his miraculous ability to his stay in the cave, to his suffering. This is not something we see in rabbinic literature. Very strange. Not strange at all if you know what everyone is reading at the time, right? Everyone is reading about those sages who live in caves and can do whatever. So basically what I suggest that this later story found in the Talmud, who talks about an early sage, takes a story about a rabbi in a cave and makes him into kind of like a holy man of our own. Now, again, no Christianity is mentioned. We just take this model of a holy man that everyone knew and use it for rabbinic purposes. You can only know if you read what everyone else was reading at the same time. He's saying stuff that the monks are saying. He's like dealing with theological. Should spiritual work overcome physical work, right? He's criticizing people working the land. Why are you doing this when you can just study all day long? This ora and labora, right? This is Torah v'avodah. What takes precedent? This is something that's found everywhere. But this specific, reference to sages and, choosing the spiritual life in a cave when they bump into the actual life of people working in agriculture and stuff. This is something that is really found in monastic literature. So this is just one example where I try to show we have to understand when this story is being created, what are people reading? What's in their minds? I'll explain with an example, right? When I teach my classes, I often bring examples when I want to talk about Jewish magic or something. I bring an example from Harry Potter because everyone read Harry Potter, right? It's after the Bible, I think. So yeah. So I think maybe it's surpassed it in some cases, but in any case, I use example from Harry Potter to talk about dark magic, and I talk about, Death Eaters, and I talk about spells, and I talk about, because this is something that we all have in common from the world we live in, to explain ancient texts, to talk about magic, to talk about, whatever, the power of words, all kinds of stuff like that. Now, this is the same thing. The rabbi want to talk about the exclusion from the world, asceticism, suffering, right? Again, spiritual life versus practical life. And they want to talk about it, and they're using a model that they know from the world around them. And it's a very real model. Everyone around them are talking about it, just like Harry Potter, right? And they're using that to talk about their Jewish ideals and ideology. So that's like one example to show, but see how hard it is. If you haven't read monastic literature, you wouldn't know. Not only wouldn't you know, I know you wouldn't know, because Rabbi Shimon Bar becomes the hero of the Zohar, a medieval book that becomes so famous because it's in the center of the new movement, the Kabbalah movement. Madonna reads it. The site of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's cave is a site of pilgrimage. I think more than 1 million people come visit it a year, blah, blah, blah. This is all of this. And I always love it because it came from an interaction between the religion and became such a central site for Jewish engagement with this idea of asceticism and whatever. But it begins and starts with a dialogue between those two religions.
Interesting. And if I can ask, I mean, it's obviously very difficult to tell because, as you're saying, this is a trope used within Christian literature at the time. That's being used by the rabbis, the idea of a holy man in a cave, etc. Is there any way of plotting the direction of influence between the Talmud and surrounding Christian communities? Because, of course, as much as Jews were reading Christian texts, presumably Christians, or maybe I'm wrong, but presumably Christians would be able to get their hands on Jewish texts, may have read them with interest, may have met the rabbis in the streets, talked to them. So is there any way, firstly, of
that it went the other way? That's a great question. And now we have to say, so we have a story about a rabbi in a cave, and we have the monastic story, right? But this is where you have to start figuring it out. You're saying there's one story in the Talmud about a rabbi in a cave. There's another story, whatever, in the Yerushalmi. We'll leave it aside for a second. That's it. And it's told about a rabbi who lived in the land of Israel in the Tannaitic period, in the 2nd century.
Centuries earlier. Yeah.
Story on a different, not of its time. It's weird. It's not typical in its ideas and its function with other ideas. This is why it became such a star in the Kabbalah that wanted to talk about this. It's a unique story. It doesn't go in line with other stories. And when you switch to the Christian world, there's gazillion stories like that. Not just stories, actual people living in caves everywhere. That's a Christian thing, right? So then you're asking who took from who? I think it's much more likely that the rabbis saw this model. They had some kind of a tradition of a rabbi during the Roman, persecution going into a cave, but they make him into this figure based on what they see around them. I think that's a much more likely scenario than assuming that they knew the story of Ashby and then the movement began from that story, and that doesn't make as much sense. We have a whole thing in religious studies where the question who took from who is frowned upon, because the assumption is that if you took from someone, then you're lesser than the original that you took from. Who's the original, right? We don't want to ask that question. But in that case, I think you can actually sometimes say, yeah, it's much more likely. And actually, that's a good guide, and this is what I outline in my books, to find more examples. So if the rabbis are dealing with the question of a rabbi who doesn't have sex with his wife anymore, he chooses to live with her without it, and then he falls and he breaks his oath and then he commits suicide as a result. It's a very famous story about Cheruta in the Talmud. And you say, where does this come from? The rabbis are famously known for not adopting this question of, celibacy and abstinence. And where did this come from? And then slowly you start looking at the Talmud, and there are cases where the rabbis start thinking, wait, Rabbi Akiva went away from his wife for 40 years to study Torah. So when they do put this side by side, you can see that sometimes they choose study over the physical relationship. Or when they talk about the Yetzer Hara, how do they deal with it? How do they do it? But you can't ignore the fact that you have a whole movement of monks who leave aside and choose celibacy as a way of life. And you're saying, wait, so that's a case where the Talmud looks at that model and say, wait, does this work for us too? Wait, why wouldn't it? Let's talk about this. Would it work? Would it not? You have to understand these in context. And again, this story doesn't mention Christianity. Not a word of Christianity is mentioned. But obviously, when you talk about abstinence from sexual activities, you have to ask yourself, wait, who's doing this at the same time? Oh, we know. The Christians, the monks are doing it. So this is, by the way, even within Christianity, it's a model that's disputed, right? Some fractions don't abide by this abstinence. So they have an argument. And within Jewish, rabbinic as well. But if you look at the entire Talmudic corpora, these stories are the minority. The vast majority of rabbinic sources, they like purivu, they like having kids, they like, the continuation of the, this is not something that they condone. How do I pick up on those cases where there's something there, that, doesn't really work with the rest, or is unique, or it's not the majority. And then I say, oh, wait, that's interesting. I know when a rabbi fasts as part of an argument and doesn't want the other side to know the answer. Wait, how does fasting work with that? So all this kind of question, every time I see something like that, I'm like, wait, it's very prevalent in the other religion at the same time. It's rare in rabbinic literature. It poses a challenge. That's a case I want to check. And by the way, it's the same thing vice versa. I'm not a Christian studies scholar, but they can do the same thing. Sometimes when you see something that doesn't work with them, and then you're like, wait, maybe that is something that is, in dialogue, in contact with Jewish tradition at the time. And then you say, wait, that's interesting.
I want to get to that a little bit later. But first, an important element of what you've said about Jewish-Christian interaction, certainly within the Talmud, is the idea of the heretic or the min. And it's probably better to use the Hebrew or Aramaic word min, because min can mean many things in the Talmud and rabbinic literature at different points. And one of the things that you've claimed essentially is that quite a few of the min stories that are in the Talmud and the way that people interact with it, that is, in fact, it's a reference to Christianity. It is recording how rabbis either interacted with Christians or how they imagined rabbis of previous generations interacting with Christians, and how they told over the stories. So could you perhaps elaborate on this a little bit? What kind of stories are being told? Could you perhaps give an example of a min story that has very strong Christian overtones? And why would it be that such interactions, engagements are recorded in the Talmud? What is the point that is trying to be made with hosting an imagined Jewish-Christian dialogue?
Good. That's a good question. By the way, I do prefer to translate min as heresy, in my stories at least. And there is a reason for that. Scholarship, went through a few stages. At first, we translated min in the context of heresy because that's the context that it's given. But then we kind of said, wait, but heretics is a word that has a lot of connotations. So we should be very wary of using it, and we should stick to the Hebrew transliterator of min. The problem is that this, pure and far and cold kind of thing took away the one thing that this word is supposed to do. It's supposed to be offensive. It's a word that's a curse word, and min doesn't do that to us, right? Min, whatever. That's a word that used to in the past to refer. We don't use it in modern Hebrew. It's not a thing. And we lost it. By the way, I'm quoting here Christine Buhle, who wrote a book about ethnos. Ethnos used to be a word that was translated as race. And then the study of ancient Christianity stopped using that because the word race in the 60s was so loaded. So they stopped using that. And they began to translate it as the Greek word ethnos. And she says, we lost. It's supposed to talk about race. It's supposed to. So we have to be aware of the difficulty of using it, but still use this word. And with the heretic and minim, it's very important. My book is called Heretic Story, and I dedicate 30 pages, first page, to explain that I chose this deliberately. I know that this is dangerous and we have to be careful, but it's meant to be an insult. So now, what are those? So there are stories, especially in the Talmud. It appears also in earlier sources, but the Babylonian Talmud has a lot of stories that basically an interaction between a rabbinic figure. I say figure because there's one story about Bolia, a woman, so I can say not rabbis, but a rabbinic figure, but most of them obviously is about rabbis. And they meet with a heretic. And when they meet with this heretic, a lot of the stories I deal with in my second book are about the biblical interpretation. Right, so there's a verse that stands in the center of the argument, and they argue over it, and then the rabbi wins, always, right? So always the rabbis win. But what are those stories, right? So the first in the 19th century and the early 20th centuries, people thought that it was always Christian, and then, tried to look for whatever, the background. But a lot of the stories are like funny stories. The heretic is stupid, he asks a stupid question, it doesn't work, it's very easily refutable. So people said, oh, it's a stupid Christian in the Talmud, and moved on. But then later people started saying, not all of them look regular Christians. Some of them look agnostic. Some of them look Greco-Roman. So maybe we should be careful and not assume that every heretic in those stories is Christian. What I do is actually kind of take us back to the 19th century. I do think that some of the stories are about Christians, and I think I can prove it in some of the cases, or at least suggest a plausible interpretation in light of Christian argument. But those stories, I think, are a way for rabbis to deal with contemporaneous Christian interpretation of scripture. So they're saying, listen, this is what the Christians are saying. Let's deal with that. And the stories often represent anxiety. These are good interpretation. These are something that we need to deal with. And the problem was that scholars, starting from medieval interpreters of the Talmud, kind of missed it. They didn't have the background needed to understand the Christian background to that question, and kind of missed it. This is why it looks stupid or refutable. But if you know the background and you know the Christian interpretation of that biblical scripture, you understand that there was an argument, a theological argument, sometimes a practical argument of praxis between the rabbis and the Christians of their time. And these stories give us a window into those arguments. And this is what I try to do in my book. So I take those kinds of like stories and I say, look, this is what it's really about. You need to understand what Christianity did with this verse. This is what the rabbis do with this verse. And they're trying to understand. What's very cool about this is that once you understand that the rabbis took very seriously the Christian interpretation. They're fearful of it. They're anxious about it. So in one of the stories, and you wanted an example. So in one of the stories, this is about a heretic that comes into a rabbi, and he says, always sounds like the beginning of a joke, right? A rabbi and a heretic talk, and they start talking about this verse that suggests that the Holy Spirit was created. So there's like an entity, a divine entity known Holy Spirit, and it was created based on a verse in Micah. Now, they argue over it, and the heretic dies while they're waiting for an argument, whatever, an answer. And Rabbi, who's arguing with this, is, breathe a sigh of relief because, the verse could have meant what the Christian was saying, and he didn't have a good answer to that. And the story ends like that. So there's a second heretic. It's a fun story. I strongly urge you to read my book, to read it, because it's a fun story to read. But the story ends with him, the first one, dying. And the argument never comes to fruition. They never come to an agreement. Who wins? So there's like an anxiety about the divine theology, about the Holy Spirit. Was it created? Was it not? Is it a lesser than God? Is it part of God? It has to do with the Trinity, and it has to do with some kind of a very, very fierce argument in the 4th and 5th century in Christian circles. And the rabbis that wrote the story are aware of it, and they're dealing with it. And again, in parentheses, this is also a story that allows me to date the story. I know when the story was written. It couldn't have been written before the 4th and the 5th century, even though it's talking about Rabbi Judah the Prince who lived in the 2nd century. So that's interesting in itself. But it gives you a lot of historical evidence. But it also shows that the author was anxious about contemporaneous Christian interpretation of Scripture. So look how much we've learned. We learned how much they know. We learned how much they care about this. And we learned about an attempt to answer this. And in this specific story, also about fractions within Christianity that argue about this, because there's a good heretic and a bad heretic. So all of this, these are stories that give me an insight into the world in the 4th and the 5th century of Jewish Christian interpretation and argument over biblical scriptures and theology.
Right. And it's interesting you mentioned the chronological development there for a moment. I want to touch on that briefly, which is that can we trace differences in attitudes? Can you trace differences, let's say, between slightly earlier and later rabbinic texts? In other words, do you notice a shift? And if so, what is that shift and what can be explained by it? Or what can explain it?
It's a good question. Also, I'm the wrong person to ask because I am very, very afraid or uncertain or shy of doing history in names of rabbis. So I know the Talmud, and the Talmud was redacted in the 6th century, and I have no clue if I'm reading a 3rd century text or a 4th century text or a 5th century or a 6th century text. I know its latest redaction date, and I would always default to the latest one. I wouldn't go, some scholars, can read in the Talmud and say, oh, that gives me evidence of the Second Temple period. I am not that kind. I can say that there is a noticeable difference between Tanaitic literature early, so Mishnah, Tosefta, legal Midrashim, and later Babylonian and Palestinian sources. You can definitely see much more engagement with Christianity in the later sources. That I can show. In addition to that, I don't know what to do with that, but I can also, this is a talk that JJ heard me give. When I started, I have this new project where I'm doing network analysis of the works that I'm doing. I know you want to ask me about that too. But when I started mapping some of those traditions, I noticed something interesting. Sometimes, I don't have enough data, but so it's just a preliminary observation. When the rabbis are dealing with New Testament tradition, I don't know when they're doing it, if they're doing it later or late, but they are dealing with early New Testament tradition. They tend to be more polemical than when they're dealing with later church father traditions. Would that be consistent? Is it always the case? Do they, fight more with New Testament tradition than they are with later? Also, do they tend to be more polemical towards stuff that come from the land of Israel as opposed to stuff that comes from other geographical areas? These are still things that need to be asked. I don't have enough data. Again, I wouldn't put them on a chronological date of composing, but I can map where the origin of those traditions come from, and then ask the question, can we see patterns? But again, we don't have enough data. I don't know. If they know Matthew, for example, the question of the Gospels, when I say New Testament, by very, very late, there were a lot of Gospels of Jesus' life going around in the ancient world. Which one did the rabbis know? Did they know the 4 that we know that was canonized in the New Testament, or did they know others? Which of the 4? Let's say they quote from Matthew. Do they know all of Matthew? That means they had the book next to their bedside table. Or did they know certain tradition? Because, I don't know, these are the ones that were most popular. Or do they know those that were played out in the street in the Holy Week, and so they could have a chance to look at it, specifically Jesus on the cross, but not what he said when he was talking in the temple? So which parts of the New Testament? All of these are questions, well, we don't know the answer to yet, right? Isn't it surprising? We're, 2024, and we still don't know the answer because we just begun to explore all the stuff that the rabbis do. And I look very much forward to checking it and examining it. We need more and more example to be able to map this properly. But we don't know the answer to that yet. So in what way did they know the New Testament? Did they read it? Did they talk to others about it? Did they see it in murals? How did the information come to them? I can answer from the actual knowledge that is found in the Talmud and say, okay, because they quoted, that means they knew it. But what did they know? We don't know any of it. That's the interesting questions we still don't know the answer to.
Fair enough. And I suppose, the mark of the good historian is not only to tell us what we think we know, but also what we absolutely do not know. And hopefully we'll find out.
Oh, you definitely got the right, interviewee for that.
Okay, good. No, I have to say, sort of temperamentally, I am sympathetic to that kind of conservative sort of historian whose most frequent answer is, we don't know, we might never know. There was one element that you mentioned earlier, which I'd like to actually ask to elaborate on a little bit, which is the types of interactions that rabbis had, or rabbis described their interactions with Christians. Specifically, something you mentioned was they sometimes did it in a way, or described it in a way that was perhaps mocking, satire, perhaps parody, something like that. And I would ask you, can you elaborate on that? Because that is a genre of rabbinic literature, which I think even those who study the rabbinic text don't understand or don't appreciate enough. And so, maybe if you could give an example, perhaps, or just tell us, in what ways, how did the rabbis describe or portray Christian beliefs and Christians themselves in a manner that can be described in that way as parodic or as mocking?
Yeah, so first I have to start with a story that kind of got me a little bit flustered, because I gave a series of talk online when the war began. I think it was in December or something like that. And it was about satire. And the first 2 lectures were about the way the Jews satire Christian tradition in the Talmud. And the third was the other side. I looked at Christian views, looking at Jewish traditions. And the first 2 talks were, I got a lot of good feedback and people were writing back and they were like, oh, laughing, and it was a great talk, blah, blah, blah. The third talk, when I was presenting how Christian mock Jews, I've never had this reaction before. It was visceral. People were so offended. They're like, how dare you teach this at a time like that? This is pure anti-Semitic, and how dare you, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, wait, we just spent 2 weeks, showing the rabbis mocking Christianity. I was doing Jesus and the Talmud stuff and doing like very, very cruel jokes. And, it's ancient time. And this is, and people couldn't bear to look at the other side doing the same thing. And I think there's a lesson here about all of us and our, perception of how we're much better than others, and how, victim, the sense of victimhood is sometimes blind us of what we do different. And I think in this time and age, this is an important lesson to learn about interaction between religious groups. So this is just to kind of frame what I'm doing. So yes, I deal a lot with humor, and I have to ask myself that question, because the Talmud often, the examples that I found are written in a satirical, polemical way. I kind of have to find it to understand that this is a mockery of Christianity. I'll give an example, right? So remember the guy who died, right? So the heretic who walks into a study house and he dies or whatever, a second heretic walks in and he tells the rabbi, the guy he walks into a room and he's like, good news, yay, good news, besorot tovat, mevaser tovat ani, blah, blah, blah. The guy who, was supposed to come back after 3 days didn't come back. He died. And they all celebrate and they're so happy. Now, again, nothing about Christianity, no words mentioned of Jesus. But if you look philologically, it's very interesting. Who said he'll be back after 3 days and then didn't come back or did come back? Obviously, we know that Jesus said that he'll be back after 3 days. But also, when he walks into a room and he says, Besorot tovot, good news, this is a term that's never, ever, mevaser tovot specifically in the verbal form, never appears anywhere else in rabbinic literature. I always say, we Jews, we don't do good news. It's not used. That's the one place. And obviously, good news or gospel or evangelion is a term that already in the early, second century or late first century is very specifically referred to very one good news. The gospel of Jesus coming back for the first time after 3 days and then coming back a final. When you say good news in Christian, evangelion, a gospel, it means the guy came back after 3 days. That's the coming of Jesus. That's the gospel of Jesus. So someone here thought it would be very funny to describe someone who promises to come back after 3 days and in fact is dead and say, yay, that's our good news, right? So that's mocking. So I'm stopping here. Not a very nice example. Not very good to, I wouldn't recommend doing that to your friend's beliefs, but that's what they did back then. Now, they do it in a way that's hidden, right? You need to know philology. No one explains to you that good news is like a mockery of the word or whatever. You need to know what evangelion means or good news to understand the joke, right? So why would they do it this way? Why is it kind of hidden? So my question is this. I think it's kind of like, it's once you know it, you can't not get it, right? It's a funny joke and you know it. My question is this. Someone who wrote this story knew about the 3 days and knew about the word evangelion, whatever. Someone who heard that story, thought it was funny enough about Christianity and decided to put it in the Talmud for us to read in 2024, right? So that's a historical fact. Someone knew this and someone understood it. How many? What kind of humor is that?
Right.
I think I'm the only one in Talmudic research, I don't know if it's true or not, that uses Stephen Colbert research in my book. Because I ask, what kind of humor is that? Is it a Saturday Night Live sketch where everyone gets the joke, right? And in this case, someone's telling the story at shul and everyone's laughing hysterically about the Christians and they're laughing. Everyone knows about the 3 days. Everyone knows about the good news and they're laughing. That's one historical description, right? There's a bunch of people who know about Christianity and they all get the joke. Or is it a Jane Austen, Mr. Darcy kind of joke when it's like very snobbish. He like mumbles something to the sister of the guy and only, Bennett gets him and it's two people. He doesn't need a lot of people to get his joke because it's very snobbish and it's a very, very high kind of humor. Is it that kind? Is it like 3 rabbis who sat in a room, mocked Christianity and no one else knew what they were talking about? That's another historical description. And there's a third option, and this is where Stephen Colbert comes in, where it's a dual audience, right? I watch Stephen Colbert and I would say about 60% of the joke because I'm not American. I don't live in America and I don't follow the news that closely to get all his references. And I'm not Christian also. A lot of his joke is classic, Christian. I don't get a lot of it, but it's still funny. I still follow up every day, even though I get 60% of the jokes. So also some of his joke works on multiple levels. It can work on, some people get half of the joke. Some people get, he has like physical jokes, he makes like faces, but he also does his intellectual joke. He's a very smart guy and he's very interesting in that respect. There's actual literature about his humor. It's research literature about him, which I use in my book. So which one is it? Is the rabbi using a dual thing where like the very high end who gets Christianity will get the full joke, but other people will still, laugh because the story is funny? So what kind of humor is that? And I don't know the answer to that. By the way, I have a new project that might help me answer that. I can tell you about this with brain imaging and stuff. That's kind of cool. If you want, I can talk about that. But in any case, it's still a question that for now, I don't know how to answer. But it's still a question worth asking. My findings, when I find a story that mocks Christianity, what does it tell me? Also, and that's a question that's been asked by Boyarin and Peter Schaefer, why? Why do it funnily? Why not openly mock Christianity? Why not say, Jesus is called a son of a Roman soldier in rabbinic literature, Ben Pantera. He's like mocked for not being an illegitimate child. That's a direct attack on Jesus. Why would they do it in the Talmud later on in a different way? Why? So Steve, Boyarin offered one thing, Schaeffer offered a different historical interpretation. We don't know why they chose this way. Were they afraid? Did they, why? So that's another question we don't know. That's about humor.
Interesting. I was just going to say a couple of things. Firstly, if you're only laughing 60% of the time in a Stephen Colbert skit, it is possible you're getting 100% of the jokes. Just, by the way, I would also say, getting back to the topic more, which is, you bring up a very interesting point, which is that, if you read something like that, satirical or scything or parodic, let's say in the Talmud. So the question isn't only who's writing this, but the question is, well, how big is the audience for this, and how many people are expected to get the joke, and is it a priority for the rabbinic writers that somebody actually gets this joke or not?
Not only that, we know that already Rashi, people in his time, didn't get it. They already lost it. We know it now because we have access to Christian literature. This is how I do it, right? I read Christian literature, but they didn't get it. We don't see those interpretations. So it was lost kind of early on. This is like, the time of the Talmud, a little bit after, but it was lost. No one knew what it meant then. So they made a wrong choice by, assuming certain kind of knowledge by keeping it in the Talmud. But at the time that this was composed, who got it? I always say, when you go to a stand-up comedian show and you see a woman, describing getting out of the house in the morning when it's raining, and she has like 3 kids, and every day he drops the umbrella and he forgets his shoe, and getting out of the house in the morning when it rains, it's awful with 3 kids, right? Now, you can go to this and it would be funny to you if you're a bachelor person and it's like, whatever. But if you're a mom who did it in the morning, you would laugh differently, right? Because you know what he's talking about and you get the nuance and you get why it's funny in a different way. So again, what kind of humor is it? Do you know Christianity firsthand? Is it your neighbor? Is it someone, have you ever heard of it or not? This is all question we need to understand in order to get what the humor is about.
I would like to press this further, but we are running short of time, and I must ask one last question, which is actually some of the methods that you're using, because I've heard some of your talks before, and you are actually using some very interesting cutting edge methods, basically imported from the sciences, essentially, in your analysis of these Talmudic and ancient Christian texts. I'd like to ask if you could, for a couple of minutes, just give us a brief synopsis of what are these mapping and language models that you're using, and why you're using them, how that helps you, because this is quite different to how most Jewish studies scholars conduct their research.
You went to the language method, which is the most boring thing. But let me give you some cool examples.
Okay. You're the best judge of this.
Let me give you some cool examples. No, you're right, because I do language analysis and I do network analysis. But actually, let's continue to talk about humor. So I'm actually collaborating with a brain scientist who knows nothing about Judaism. And we got connected because she works on prior knowledge, what areas of the brain work when you got prior knowledge when you're hearing some information. So she's like, she takes a story about a guy calling his friend and saying, "Where's my wife?" And half of the audience heard that he's paranoid, and half heard that his wife is cheating on him. What area of the brain, when they were hearing the same conversation, what area of the brain would work? For example, right? So when I heard about, a joint friend connection, she said, this is exactly the question you're interested in. And we're going to run a series of actual tests, but actual human being. I'm going to give them the Talmudic stories. People in Israel know nothing about Christianity. And I'm going to feed half of them the background of Christian knowledge, and half of them would come with no knowledge. And I want to see how funny the joke is to either of them and which area of the brain works. I actually want to ask that question about the ancient world. I don't know if I'll get an answer, but we'll try to figure out how much of the prior knowledge do you assume when you keep a story like that in the Talmud. For example, she told me there's a question, how did the rabbis know about Christianity? Did they read it or did they hear it? So for example, her studies shows that it doesn't matter. The same areas of the brain work the same way, whether you got the information by reading, by oral. That's a huge piece of information. We don't care how the rabbis knew about Christianity in terms of the cognitive process that they went through, if it's oral or written. That's an important piece of knowledge that I incorporate from cognitive science into my question of humor. That's one. Second, a project that I'm working on these days, there's a whole series of realistic stuff that is happening with blowing a shofar into a pit, or the shofar and the chatzotzot being blown together. Can you hear it? Can you not? I'm working on the bat scholars who work on auditory senses, and we're going to run a list of experiments to try and see if the rabbis were right, or what were their auditory perception when they imagined voice and echo in ancient sugyot of the Talmud. So I'm doing that too. I'm working with someone from archaeology to try to check correlation between what they saw in the world around them on murals and stuff, and if they cared more about them in rabbinic literature. And lastly, and this is the lecture you talked about, I'm actually using network analysis to try to figure out, we discussed today, which of the sources are connected to rabbinic literature. How, if we map them, can we start answering the question of what the rabbis did or not using computational tools? Actually, harvesting examples by using natural language processing, that the computer will come up with examples that are tied together, and then mapping them on maps of network analysis and all kinds of stuff like that to try and answer some of the questions we discussed today. So this is so much fun and a lot of excitement. And I haven't even begun to tell you about reconstructing ancient texts from the 13th century, who quoted text from the 3rd century that was lost to us, the Mechilta, and coming up with way to reconstruct it using computational tools. So all of this fun stuff.
It's incredibly funny. It's so funny because often when I speak to scholars in the Jewish studies field, I'm fascinated by in the text they read and the theories they propose and the different ideas and books they've written, etc. Very rarely am I entranced by the methods they are using. That it's genuinely cutting edge stuff.
All you people listening to us, there's nothing more fun than to study the Talmud, period. I don't understand why anyone would make a different career choice than the one I made. And this is why. It's always fun. I have to tell you that I've just been nominated I'm appointed as the vice president of my university. I've been serving as the job as 8 months. And I'm doing important work, especially now in this time. I'm responsible for global engagement of Ben-Gurion University and in connection with other university, but it's hurting my research time. And I always look at it and I say, I do important, and I believe in my work, especially in this time for Israel and Ben-Gurion, but how can I do less of that, what we just talked about? So this is my dilemma.
Okay, I think we will have to leave it there for the time being, but you've given us plenty of food for thought, and we hope to have you back. Professor Michal Bar-Asher Siegal, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. We look forward to your future research and hope to have you back at some point.
Thank you, JJ and Alicia, for everything.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.